I have been asked to speak to you about the politics of responsibility. This seems to me to be a very sobering task because it's very easy to admonish people and say that they're behaving irresponsibly. It's also very easy to criticize politicians or others for being irresponsible. But what does it mean to be responsible? What would a politics of responsibility look like? How can the word responsibility shift from being a mode of critique to being a mode of practice? This is the challenge that I'd like to take up today. It seems to me that if we're going to speak about a politics of responsibility, we have to have a sense of the thing that comes before politics. If we want to have an idea of how we might shift from whatever this thing we have now is to a politics of responsibility, I think we have to be able to say what this thing we have now is and where it comes from. In other words, we have to be able to answer the question, what comes before politics? What is making the present political era so strange? Why is it that the wrong people are in the wrong places doing the wrong things? But also, why is it all so strange? Why is it all so uncanny? I think the answer has to do with time. I think the thing, the concept, the experience that comes before politics is time. And I think if we want to get to a politics of responsibility, and if we want to understand the present state of general irresponsibility, we have to get our minds around how time works now in politics. What I'd like to suggest, if you'll bear with me for just a moment, is that what we're experiencing is the shift from one sense of time to another sense of time. That what we have done is give up on history as a way of experiencing politics and life, and instead embraced first one and then another way of experiencing time, both of which together are killing democracy before our eyes. The first way of experiencing time, what I call the politics of inevitability, die Politik der Unausweichlichkeit, the politics of inevitability, is something which I think has been dominant from about 1989 to, let's say, about 2008. The politics of inevitability, and this should sound familiar to you, especially those of you who are younger, because this is essentially the bath that we've poured over you for 3 decades. The politics of inevitability says progress. The politics of inevitability does not ask what is good, because the politics of inevitability says the future will have the same good stuff as the present, just more of it. The politics of inevitability says there's no alternative. The politics of inevitability proposes that there's a clear path from where we are now to the future, and that there's only one path. The consequence of this, of course, is that responsibility dies. If we don't have to ask what virtue is in politics, and if we are assured that regardless of what we do, larger forces, usually economic forces, are pushing us in the single right direction to the only possible good future, then individual choices don't matter at all. Now, there's an American version of this, which later in this lecture you will smile and laugh about. There is a European version of this as well, which will make you sad when you hear it. But for the time being, what I want to suggest is that this style of thinking, this sense of time, this bubble in which we've been living has been shared in a general way across the West, and that this has a great deal to do with where we are now. Because the problem with the politics of inevitability is not just that it's completely and utterly wrong as a description of life, politics, and anything else, The problem with the politics of inevitability is that it opens the door to something else. What I would propose is that in the last 10 years or so, we've shifted from the politics of inevitability to something that I would call the politics of eternity, die Politik der Ewigkeit. Now, I'm going to try to explain what this means, but before I do, let me just reach out at something that I think we've all experienced. What happened to the future? Where did the future go? Why is it that after 250 years or so of consistently producing competing political visions of reasonable futures, the West seems no longer able to do so? Why is it that although quantitatively speaking, we have more wealth and technology than ever before, our discussion about possible futures is so unbelievably impoverished that would astonish political thinkers from every generation from the Enlightenment until today? How did that happen? And moreover, why do we think it's normal? That is what I mean by the triumph of the politics of eternity. We've gone from a situation where we took for granted that there was one possible future and no alternatives to a situation in which there is no future at all. What the politics of eternity says is that time is not a line into the future. Time is a circle. The same thing happens over and over again. And it is literally the same thing. It is always the guilty, violent, sexually crazed people from outside who are going to violate us, the innocent, good people on the inside. As with the politics of inevitability, the politics of eternity only gives you one possible alternative. It's us versus them all the time, forever, in a loop. Whereas the politics of inevitability gives you one future, the politics of eternity gives you zero futures, because what happens is that you're looping around and around and around and again back to the past to seek the enemies, but also to seek the imaginary moment when you yourself were perfectly innocent. Likewise, the politics of eternity does not ask you what virtue is in politics. It doesn't ask you what's good in politics. It doesn't need to ask you, because of course, if you were the innocent victim, then you must be good. And if you're constantly attacked by those outsiders, well, they must be evil. And it's astonishing that this form of innocence dialogue can be carried out regardless of how powerful you are. You can be China and claim to be the eternal victim. You can be Russia and claim to be the eternal victim. You can be the United States and claim to be the eternal victim. You can be the President of the United States and claim to be the eternal victim literally every day. So this form, don't laugh at the first Trump joke. It makes you seem too easy. And also, it's not a joke. So what the politics, the reason why it's so easy to shift from the politics of inevitability to the politics of eternity, the reason why we have made this shift has precisely to do with responsibility. The politics of inevitability takes the sense of responsibility away. It says we don't have to do anything because it's all going to turn out well anyway. The politics of eternity says it doesn't matter what we do because it's all going to turn out badly anyway. And so when people who believe in the politics of inevitability are shocked because a referendum goes the way they don't expect, or an election goes the way they don't expect, or they realize that they're not going to live as well as their parents, or whatever it might be, various shocks in various places across the West for the last 10 years have led to this. When people are shocked, they shift from a sense of inevitability to a sense of eternity. We think all is going to be well no matter what we do, and then we think all is going to be ill, all is going to go badly, regardless of what we do. That's how we shift. Now, let me give you an example, or let me give you two examples. I take it from your nodding that you have some sense of what I'm talking about. But the case I'd like to make is that this shift from inevitability to eternity is what is happening before our eyes in some of the most significant events in world politics. Take, for example, the United States of America. I mean, take as much of it as you want. No, you have to take it because the things that happen in my country happen then in your country, which is why I'm talking to you. So take the United States of America. Consider what happened to the United States of America in the year 2016. The shift from the Obama administration to the Trump administration is a shift from the politics of inevitability to the politics of eternity. Or to put it in a sharper way, the shift from a situation where Americans thought they were electing their president to a situation where a foreign country actually chose our president is the shift from the politics of inevitability to the politics of eternity. The American politics of inevitability made us vulnerable to something that we wouldn't otherwise have expected. The American politics of inevitability, and again, this is the part where you get to feel good because I'm going to say all these things, you think about us anyway. The American politics of inevitability says there are no alternatives, history is over, capitalism causes democracy, more capitalism causes more democracy, technology will always make people enlightened, and so on and so forth. That is not a parody, right? I mean, that's like 85% of American book sales right there. So what the American politics of inevitability does is open us up. It makes us weak. Because, of course, if you don't think there are alternatives, then you don't see the alternatives even when they're staring you in the eye. If you think that capitalism brings democracy, you don't notice that capitalism brings measurably terrifying increases in wealth and income inequality, which make it very hard for Americans to believe in a future that's coming, let alone coming and going to be good. If you believe that technology is automatically enlightening, then you don't notice that internet penetration actually correlates not with democracy, but with the destruction of democracy. And that you're very slow to realize that the internet is actually making us worse at being citizens rather than better. I was giving a talk at a gymnasium in Vienna a few days ago, and in German, which I won't impose on you. But one of the things I said was, Sie wissen doch, dass vor 10 Jahren alle die Erwachsenen klüger waren als jetzt, right? And they did know that, right? And they knew that I was talking about the internet, right? Without my having to say so, which should perhaps give us all a bit of pause. So the point is that the American politics of inevitability opens us up to what Russia did to us. Now, what Russia did to us was deliberate and very carefully planned, and it came from a very special place. The way to understand why Russia is so important, I think, is to think about the politics of eternity. Why is Russia so important? Why are we constantly talking about Russia? Or to pose it the way that the Obama administration posed the question, why should we care about a regional power that doesn't have any technological innovation and doesn't export anything besides raw materials? That was the Obama administration's attitude towards Russia. Why is that a mistake? Because that's the politics of inevitability. If you think politics is only about economics, well then Russia's a regional power. But if Russia's a regional power, why does it get to choose the president of the United States? And why do we get to keep talking, why do we have to keep talking about Russia? The answer is not that Russia has to be autocratic. The answer is not that Russia is not a European country. The answer is rather that Russia has reached the politics of eternity faster than anyone else. Russia constitutes a model which is close to an ideal type of what the politics of eternity would look like. Russia reached the place where there is no future faster than we did, and now it is bringing us along, or trying to bring us along with it. Why is there no future in Russia? This is a very important question, because The Zukunftslosigkeit in Russia is a kind of black hole which is bringing many Germans closer and closer to it all the time. First of all, hydrocarbons. If the way that your country survives is by exporting hydrocarbons, if you are a hydrocarbon oligarch, Russian, American, Saudi, it doesn't matter, if you are a hydrocarbon oligarch, you don't talk about the future, because the future is global warming. Second, oligarchy. According to the radical left-wing organization Credit Suisse, which compiles an annual wealth report, the country with the greatest wealth and income inequality, greater even than the United States, is the Russian Federation. When you're in a situation of extreme wealth and income inequality, there is no social advancement. When there is no social advancement, it's very hard to talk about the future, as, by the way, Mr. Putin just acknowledged in Munich a couple of days ago. The third reason there's no future in Russia is succession. So Max Weber has already been invoked twice. I understand it is actually, we are now in the iron cage that we have to all cite Max Weber. So I will cite Max Weber. Max Weber made the very important point about charismatic leadership. Charismatic leadership is when you are the guy who takes off his shirt and controls all of the good things and hands them all out and has a beautiful myth about yourself. That is fun while it lasts. That is, by the way, a direct citation of Max Weber. Max Weber writes, "That is fun while it lasts." Okay. What Weber says, though, is that if you want to move from charismatic leadership to having a state, there has to be some kind of legal organizing principle which allows the charismatic leader to pass on state authority to a successor. That is what Russia currently does not have. And this is by the way, the major problem with neo-authoritarianism. It's very attractive for a moment, but even in Russia now, it's clear that Putin has a problem, and the problem is succession. In Russia, you cannot talk about a successor. You literally cannot talk about a successor. It is physically impossible to talk about a successor. And when you don't have a successor, in other words, when it just might be your own fault that your state is going to cease to exist, that's another very strong reason not to talk about the future. Now, what Russia has done with the Zukunftslosigkeit, with the absence of a future, is to create a new form of domestic and foreign politics. In domestic politics, the idea is, yes, all of what I've just said is true. We're corrupt, it's unequal, there's no future, but it's exactly the same everywhere else. So this is the fundamental difference between the Russian Federation and the Soviet Union. Rather than proposing a vision that the world should live up to, the Russian Federation proposes instead that there are no rules, no laws, no truth, certainly no responsibility anywhere. So yes, things are bad in Russia, but things are terrible everywhere. This is interesting. Yes, we lie all the time. We Russian leaders lie all the time. We lie nonstop. Vladislav Surkov actually just published a very interesting article which says this essentially word for word. We lie all the time, but that's okay, because everyone lies all the time. And you should love our lies because they are our lies. This is a new form of nationalism in the world. The way that it works in foreign policy is to actually try to reconstruct the rest of the world so that this is all true. To, for example, help the British vote for leaving the European Union, or to help the Americans vote for Donald Trump, or to help AfD in Germany, or to help the Front National in France, because all of these things actually do make the West look ridiculous. And it does make it harder for us to say there are facts and laws and institutions and they ought to be taken seriously. So the technique of how Russia gets into the American political system is very interesting, and I write about it at length in the book. But the basic thing to understand is that it is a Russian politics of eternity, a Russian futurelessness, the kind of gravitational power of that black hole that breaks our politics of inevitability, that leads us to a situation where Donald Trump can be president. Mr. Trump is precisely a product of an American version of capitalism which says no rules are good rules. He is precisely the sort of person who is in a position to benefit from propaganda on his side, which is nothing but lies and slander. In other words, he is the perfect politician of irresponsibility because he's the perfect politician of eternity. What he's very good at doing, and he is very good at doing it, is telling Americans, especially white Americans, that there was a time when we were all innocent and that it's everyone else's fault, and therefore we should make America great again. What he's very good at doing is creating a fantasy of us and them, divided by an invisible wall, which he will never actually build and has no intention of building, because it's the idea of the wall that matters, the idea of the innocent us and the idea of the guilty them. What he is very good at doing is using technology to create the sense of an eternal present, where everyone is either so exhilarated or so angry that we forget completely about the future and live entirely in the present. That's the politics of eternity, and that's where we are. Now, normally, at this point in a lecture like this, where one talks about Mr. Trump, one would go on to say that, but in Europe, everything is different and better. That is not the pivot that I'm about to make. It is very easy to look at someone else's politics of inevitability and say, that is not true. That's a delusion. How can those stupid Americans believe those things? What's harder, and what I'm going to ask you to do now, is to look at your own politics of inevitability and ask how it makes you vulnerable to the politics of eternity. Because you have one, and it does. So the European politics of inevitability has a couple parts. The first, strikingly like the American one, is materialist. The idea that if you get the economics of European integration correct, then the politics will follow and the culture will follow, right? Not really true. But the more disturbing part of your politics of inevitability, and the deeper part, and the truly dangerous part, is your idea of who is doing the learning. So your notion is that economics leads people to learn about politics and to learn about culture. But the people in question in this story that you're all educated in, and which is 100% wrong, is that it is the nation or the nation state that does the learning. You have a story about how there was a First World War and that was pretty bad, and the Second World War was even worse, and therefore the clever European nation states learned that they should trade coal and steel and then other things and so on and so forth, and that's why you're wiser than the Americans. This is completely and utterly and dangerously wrong, and it is your politics of inevitability. Your idea that there was a European nation state in history and that it learned from war that war was bad and hence integration is a dangerous and misleading idea, and it is about to destroy the European Union. Let me first say why it's wrong, and then I'll say why it's dangerous. It's wrong because the history of Europe is not a history of the nation state. The history of Europe is a history of empire. Whether we're talking about Germany in the Second World War, whether we're talking about the Netherlands, France, Portugal, Spain, Great Britain, perhaps above all, the history of Europe is not a history of the nation state. These places were not nation states, or if they were, only for a brief period of a few years. These places were empires. So what matters in the 20th century is not a nation state learning, never happens. What matters in the 20th century is that when European empires break down, they have a place to go. The European Union was not a choice made by nation states who were growing wise from experience. The European Union was an existential necessity for imperial fragments that were losing colonial wars around the world. And by the way, one of the reasons why the whole story of learned from war, economic integration, then politics is so nice is that it allows you precisely not to take responsibility for Algeria and Indochina and all those other wars that somehow you kept fighting after you learned that war was bad, right? The story of European integration, I told you this wasn't going to be as much fun as the American part. The story of European integration is precisely the story that allows you to be irresponsible about your actual history and generates this nice story of virtue about how you learned from war, but the Americans didn't. Not true. The only difference between Europeans and Americans when it comes to war is that Europeans notice when they lose them. That's the only difference, right? If we have a problem, it's that we keep losing wars and don't notice. But you didn't stop fight. See, it's so easy, right, to laugh at the Americans. But you kept fighting wars after the Second World War. You kept doing it and doing it and doing it and doing it until you lost. And the German history, which Germans are very happy to overlook, is that the Second World War was not about a Holocaust in which Germans killed German Jews. Most German Jews survived. German Jews are only about 3% of the total victims. The Holocaust takes place during a colonial war, the object of which was basically to recreate Africa in Eastern Europe. If not for that colonial aspiration, there would be no Holocaust. And that colonial aspiration is what also leads to the mass murder of 3 million Soviet prisoners of war, roughly 1 million non-Jewish Poles, and all kinds of other victim groups that are generally not mentioned or overlooked. The Second World War in Germany is domesticated and reduced and minimized so that the colonial aspect of it can be forgotten. That is how you have a politics of inevitability. Now, why? So that's why it's all wrong. Why does that matter? Here's how it matters. It matters because the debate about the European Union is taking place not in the future where it should be. The debate about the European Union is taking place in a past that never happened. The debate about the European Union is a series of national debates in which national political elites argue about should there be integration or should we go back to the nation state. But you can't go back to the nation state because you never had the nation state. The discussion about Brexit is therefore almost entirely mythical. The Conservative Party in Britain is not proposing going back to something. It's actually proposing taking a leap into something entirely new because there has never been a British nation state. And I think it's very unlikely that there will ever be a British nation state. I don't think that Brexit will happen, but if it does, it won't be Brexit because Britain will not survive it. There's no reason to think that Britain will survive it. Okay, so this is how your politics of inevitability makes you vulnerable. And this thing which I've slowed down and tried to explain is, by the way, totally obvious to your neighbors. So whether it's a Ukraine that looks at the European Union and wants to get in because it understands that the historical purpose of the European Union is to take corrupt, flawed states and make them better, or whether it's a Russian Federation that looks at the European Union and attacks Ukraine and then attacks the European Union, from the outside it is totally clear that the alternatives are integration and empire. Those are the real alternatives, integration and empire. The triumph of the politics of eternity in Europe is to recast the debate so that your actual history and therefore your actual possibilities are not discussed. What are discussed are entirely fictional things which never happened in the past and therefore are unlikely also to happen in the future. And predictably, your enemies, Russian, but also increasingly American, people like Mr. Trump or Mr. Bannon or Mr. Bolton, will tell you, yes, go back to the nation state. That will be wonderful for you. And why do people like Mr. Putin or Mr. Bannon tell you that? because they know it is completely bogus and a trap. And I think it's probably important for Europeans to realize that in time. So this is how your politics of inevitability makes you vulnerable to a politics of eternity. And this is where we are as we head into the European elections of May of 2019. You might have noticed that exactly the same group of people who made Trump happen in America in 2016 are now working in Europe in 2019. You might also have noticed that the exact same group of Russian bots, I mean literally the same Russian bots, who were at work on our presidential election are now at work in Europe in 2019. So these are examples of how inevitability becomes eternity, and I hope that I've done something to bring them home. What then would a politics of responsibility look like? To make the most important point at the beginning, a politics of responsibility would have to be about the future. Europe is going to exist in the future, or it's not going to exist at all. If Europe continues to discuss its reality in terms of non-existent pasts, it can't last for very long. But the other side of that is that Europe is the one entity in the world which is actually politically and institutionally equipped to deal with the real problems of the 21st century. There is unfortunately, as far as I can tell, no propaganda outfit in the European Union that's capable of making that point, but it's nevertheless true. Only the European Union is actually capable of dealing with the major challenges of the 21st century. Okay, what would a politics of responsibility look like? First, responsibility itself, the virtue of responsibility, has to be affirmed as a virtue. The thing about inevitability is that it says the good thing's going to happen anyway. Eternity says the bad thing's going to happen anyway. A politics of responsibility does away with the anyway. The politics of responsibility has to begin from the notion that politics must have at least one virtue in it, that we can't talk about politics without virtue. Second, history. The politics of eternity and the politics of inevitability both pretend to be history. In fact, they're parodies of history and they're destroying history. In order to have responsibility, though, we have to have history, because responsibility involves seeing the possibilities and limitations that flow from the past, making the decision in the future, in the present, understanding that there are a limited set of possibilities in the future. And by the way, the same thing goes for democracy. Democracy requires historical time. If you don't have past, present, and future, you also can't have democracy, because voting requires exactly those three same kinds of time. Third, a politics of responsibility would require the active production of factuality. The politics of inevitability says, whatever the facts are, I'm going to merge them into my story of how things are turning out great. Again, 85% of the American book market. The politics of eternity says, facts don't matter, you have your facts, I have my facts, all that really matters is spectacle. In order for there to be a politics of responsibility, we have to insist on factuality as something that has to be produced. There's a long tradition in Anglo-Saxon political thought which says that so long as there's open debate, the truth will emerge. Like many things in Anglo-Saxon political thought, that is completely wrong. In order for there to be truth to emerge, there has to be someone who is actually producing the facts. In other words, there have to be engaged policies to support local media and especially investigative reporting. If nobody does the work of investigative reporting, then there are no facts in the space and the truth cannot possibly emerge. The fourth thing, I think, would have to be an affirmation of humanity, by which I don't mean humanity in the sense of being humane. I mean humanity in the sense of being human. One of the problems that we face is that we're ceding so much ground to the machines in our public life that we're not aware that they don't have a sense of responsibility, right? So much of what goes wrong in politics these days has to do with the fact that algorithms, which don't care about us one way or the other, are pretty good at figuring out what makes us angry and what makes us anxious and what makes us afraid. That is changing the face of politics. And the only way to deal with that is to address it directly and say that there have to be digital human rights. We have to begin a human rights discussion again in a world where the main problem is not physical abuse, but psychological abuse. And a short note about Germany. It's a terrible idea to digitalize the classroom. It's a terrible idea. You should stop now. It's a terrible idea. You should stop now. In the United States, all the school districts who brought computers in, all the early movers moving computers in were the early movers moving computers out. All the people who create this technology in Silicon Valley, all of them send their kids to schools where there are no computers. Steve Jobs put computers in schools and then said, I did that to make money. It's a bad idea to have computers in schools. You should not put computers in German schools until you have a generation of teachers of computer programming who know more about the computers than the children do. And you do not have that. Digitalizing the classroom in these conditions is a terrible, terrible mistake. You will lose a generation of school children. You will also lose a generation of teachers. 10 years from now, you will pull the computers out and you'll have to start all over again. So what you should instead do is take the $5.5 billion, euros, give every school teacher in Germany a raise, and allow the child who has the best grades in every class to destroy the computer with a hammer. Because that would be ein unvergessbares Erlebnis für diese Schülerin oder für diesen Schüler. Und würde auch nicht nur seine Klasse und nicht nur seinen Lehrern, aber auch eine ganze Generation retten. Okay, so, next point. Politics of responsibility has to involve sovereignty. The problem of oligarchy, the main problem of oligarchy, is that very wealthy people and very wealthy corporations, like, for example, Amazon, Google, are too good at not paying taxes inside places like the European Union. And finally, a politics of responsibility has to involve new sources of energy. Hydrocarbons are at the root, in many ways, of the politics of eternity. The people who give us the hydrocarbons are the same people who not just deny climate change, but they're also the same people who keep us from thinking about the future at all. In order to begin thinking about the future again, we have to have new sources of energy, not just to head off the worst, but to make the best possible. So again, in Germany, I would just suggest it's not good enough to keep saying in this kind of nice Protestant way, okay, no more nuclear energy, no more coal, I'm going to be very good. You have to act, I mean, while you're at it, why don't you just say no more Russian gas? I'd like to see that. But while you're at it, you have to say, what are we going to create, right? Why aren't the Germans the ones who are solving fusion? I don't understand that. Why aren't the Germans the ones who are solving fusion? Because if you solve fusion, instead of the Chinese who are going to fix it, who are going to solve it if it's not you, then you would be bringing into the world a new source of energy which would change politics completely. Okay, so to close, thank you for your patience. The politics of responsibility has to have two sides. On the one side, we all have to be more responsible. We have to see responsibility as a virtue. On the other side, we have to create institutions that make it possible for individuals to be responsible. We can't say it's all down to the individuals. There has to be a dialectic. There has to be a dance of time moving forward between the individual who sees the virtues of responsibility and practices them, and the institutions that continue to make that possible. That's what it would be like for history to be moving forward again. That's what it would be like for this logjam of the politics of eternity to be broken. And that's what I mean by a politics of responsibility. Thank you very much.
So. Ich habe viele Jahre in der Oper gesungen und ich habe nach dieser Zeit dieses Stück geschrieben. Und ich denke, es wäre vielleicht interessant zu lernen, der innere Dialog im Kopf des Opernsängers. Also was passiert auf der Bühne im Kopf, wenn man da steht und das Orchester, der böse Dirigent, das Publikum und dann einfach dastehen oder wenn es eine Regietheater ist, nackt dastehen und singen muss. Das ist the inner voice, the inner dialogue of the opera singer. And the translators, good luck.
Happy with the situation as it stands.